Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Massachusetts has 47 former military sites that need some form of investigation and potential remediation, potential cost of $126 million. We have at least 10 Superfund sites that will lose access to critical cleanup services. And we have a Trump administration which is proposing a $1 billion cut in the Corps of Engineers budget and slashing the entire EPA budget by nearly a third. So that's just so irresponsible because these individual communities, they're left with a legacy that they didn't create. Irresponsible kind of management ultimately created these problems, both in Superfund and in the problems that the Army Corps looks at, and they don't have enough money to deal with it. We ran into the same thing in the Reagan administration. What they did was they really harbored an animus towards the Superfund program, and they just began defunding. They named Dan Gorsuch as the head of the EPA, Rita Lavelle as the head of the Superfund program, and one of the top 5 sites in America was the Woburn site that I represented, which ultimately became the subject of a movie and a book called A Civil Action. And in 1986, I had to release a report called Deadly Delay, what the EPA was doing deliberately in Woburn, kind of slowing it down, notwithstanding the number of children who had contracted leukemia, the number of families that had been totally, irreparably harmed. And all we're seeing here is just a repetition. This whole idea that you can attack, an agency in general without ultimately impacting the lives of ordinary people. So, Ms. Smith, let me begin with you. What do you think the impact is going to be of extending and ultimately extending the deadlines that it will take in order to clean up these sites, and what the impact then is on the public health and safety of people who live in those neighborhoods?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. As I indicated before, in Washington State in particular, and at the Hanford site in particular, delays in cleanup progress mean just unacceptable lengths of cleanup. Hanford is currently scheduled to be cleaned up by 2070, and we've seen some budget indicators that could go beyond and well into like the year 3000, which seems unfathomable. And it does place unacceptable risks on both the local community and the local resources. It
absolutely does not seem unfathomable to me. I issued a report in 1987 on the Hanford Reservation and on the lack of progress that was being made. It was actually, that was denial. That was deadly delay right there. They knew what was going on. They knew what they had left behind. The military didn't want to deal with it. They didn't want it to come out of their budget, right? So we need more bombs over here that Hanford had been producing, but they don't want to then deal with the consequences left behind for the public. So how devastating will this be to you, General, in terms of your ability to be able to deal with all of these sites that are under the Army Corps jurisdiction?
So, sir, we do deal with 3 different types of accounts. Clearly, there's Superfund, FUSRAP, and FUDS. So all of those are different funding streams.
What does FUDS stand for?
So, sir, FUDS is formerly used defense site.
Formerly abused, used, now abused military sites, meaning the military is just walking away from it. Formerly, that's a nice FUD. And what's the middle one?
The FUSRAP, sir.
What does that stand for?
I've got it here. It's a long acronym.
But the name of what you described will tell us what it is.
Formerly used sites remedial action program.
There it is, yeah. So, but the remedial action program is now going to be just push back, push back, push back, because you need money. A vision without funding is an hallucination, okay? So you can't pretend that without money, without the personnel, you're going to be able to solve this problem. So you'll have to triage this then, huh, General?
So, sir, we do a risk-informed decision process on every one of these sites. We take a look at the complexity of the site and the danger of the site.
No, I appreciate that. So you're going to have to leave behind sites that you've determined to be dangerous, but not as dangerous as the ones that need more help immediately.
They will not be able to get attention as fast as others. Yes.
Right, exactly. So you just say to those people, sorry, not enough room on the lifeboat, and, you're just going to have to stay on board here. Yes, ma'am.
If I may, I am so glad you asked this question, Senator Markey, because Ranking Member Carper asked a question earlier about funding and issues around sites, and I misheard him and misspoke and said, and so I want to correct that answer. Because in Alaska, we would take cuts to funding for Army Corps of Engineers, for DoD, FUDS programs, for EPA. It would have an extremely detrimental impact on, on the cleanup of sites across the state of Alaska. We absolutely need increased efficiencies and better coordinating between federal agencies. But if we saw an even further decline in cleanup of our contaminated sites, our Native people are very concerned about food security, about things leaching into our rivers, into our lakes, where our fish are, into our land, where we hunt and fish. We have concerns over significantly high rates of cancer among our Native people. Some very strongly believe that this is linked to the contamination that we're experiencing throughout our Native communities. And we're also concerned about drinkable water, because we do have locations near our Alaska Native villages where you can't drink the water. So thank you very much for the opportunity to say that.
And let me just say this. I had a mother, Ann Anderson, her name was, come into my office in Congress, 1979, and she brought her little boy with her, Jimmy, and she just sat in my office and told me that Jimmy had leukemia, and that she had actually gone door to door, found other mothers who also had little girls and boys with leukemia in one area that was only like a tenth of the size of the whole city, but it was where all the contaminated wells were, where all this residue had just been left behind, the arsenic, the mercury, whatever, in the water and in the land. And she went door to door, and she found all these kids, and every mother and father felt that they had just been unlucky. Oh, my God, and then they figured out that it wasn't. And so that's really, along with Love Canal, where the Superfund program began, with Woburn and with Love Canal. And it was a tough fight. The city was in denial because it would ruin property values if you made all this public, and you have all these issues, and the EPA was not that enthusiastic about coming in, especially after Reagan took over and named Dan Gorsuch and Rita Lavelle. But eventually, it took a long time, we cleaned up the site. And on that site now is a huge industrial site and a huge transportation center, which we then named the Jimmy Anderson Transportation Center, which now creates thousands and thousands of jobs. So it does work. When you clean it up, you can reuse it then for community purposes. But as long as you're in denial, more children die across the country. More families are exposed to this. More property is never used because the Army walked away from it, because the defense industry walked away from it, because Monsanto or other companies walked away from it and left the community to figure it out. They can't do it alone. They need the federal government to help them. There's just no capacity in an individual community. And that just transformed the whole way this community views itself. And it's now, it can see in retrospect that it was wrong to kind of get mad at the mother, and saying, oh my goodness, you can't talk about this, it's going to ruin property values. So I just hope we don't have to repeat history again, because there's too many people depending upon us, because we know that the Army needs the resources. The private sector companies have walked away. And unless we have a comprehensive way of looking at it, families are going to suffer. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much.
Thank you, Senator Markey.